Welcome, and thank you all today for joining BWorks webinar entitled Helping Consumers Manage Debt with Behavioral Science. There's no doubt that this is a very timely topic, given rising inflation this year and increasing interest rates, and combined with lots of talk and speculation around coming recession in 2023. No doubt there'll be tough times ahead of us. And with those tough times, what we do know is there'll be increasing consumer debt. And with that, consumers will be struggling to make payments. Today, we have two of our finest behavioral scientists that have specialized for many years in all things financial services. We have Michelle Hilscher and Juan Camilo Salcedo. Michelle has a PhD in psychology from the University of Toronto, heads up our financial services portfolio in North America. And Michelle has worked on a range of organizations and clients, including the Ontario Securities Commission, the Investment Funds Institute of Canada, Sun Life, and British Columbia Securities Commission. Juan is our regional director for LATAM. He's worked on many clients, specifically in Mexico, and also heads up our financial services offering in that region. Today's session, we hope to give you three key takeaways as it pertains to the rising debt burden that consumers will face, right, and the strategies and tactics that you can take away. First and foremost, Michelle and Juan will give you an overview of the strategies that organizations can use to help consumers before they miss payments. In other words, some preemptive nudges and tactics you can deploy. Secondly, looking at strategies to help with debt recovery. And finally, an overview of the mindset and the relationships with money that consumers have developed, particularly during the pandemic, and what that means when it comes to helping consumers get through a potential recession in 2023. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Michelle, who will kick us off. But maybe just before that, if you've got any questions, please feel free to drop them into chat. We will answer if we can. No doubt we will be able to, but certainly if follow-up emails post the webinar, we will be answering those questions together with a full recording. So over to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Lovely. So we're just going to get our slides up there. Thank you, Shannon. So I think we can actually move to the next slide. And I think what I want to really underline is something that Sean's just said, and that's that we know that 2023 is going to be challenging, and that, you know, whether it's individuals, households, or organizations, that we are going to need a leg up. And so I'm so glad that we're here today to talk about behavioral science and what it can mean for consumers. Now, we do a tremendous amount of work in North America and LATAM, to name a few of our regions. And what we're seeing is that, yes, you know, these are places where the outlook is concerning. If we look in Canada, for example, we see that in recent months, inflationary pressure has been very hard to ignore, and that it's actually been more persistent than what we expected, and that it's actually putting pressure on spending categories that are typically immune. So what that means is that we see more and more consumers who are paying with credit for basics in their lives. We also are seeing, obviously, that interest rate hikes have happened, and that more of them are predicted for 2023. And that's going to mean that consumers are going to need to make decisions about the trade-offs in their lives. What are the debt payments that they're going to prioritize, and what ones are going to have to take a back burner position, unfortunately, because they're not able to make all of the payments. And although I would say that the employment rate has been doing better than perhaps what we've been expecting, I don't think consumers see it that way. In fact, I think that people are bracing. And what that means is that they're not actually using the money that they could to pay off debt right now, and instead are kind of squirreling it away, anticipating that things may be very challenging in the months to come. If we look at LATAM, what we're seeing there is that post-pandemic recovery was actually quite strong, but global financial conditions are reversing this upward trend. And you are also seeing that there are different social tensions that exist alongside inflationary pressures related to food and energy insecurity. So those are definitely major threats to the region's growth. So all in all, this is not the best news for consumers or organizations. And what we want to do today is to really think about, well, what can we do in the face of these challenges? So, how are organizations supposed to prepare, but also what can we do as individuals and households, ideally to keep in front of that storm, but also to help ourselves out if, a collection recovery needs to happen. So definitely the solution, I think, we think is about behavioral science being part of what the approach is that organizations use to support consumers. And I think it's particularly important, in fact, right now to consider consumer behavior because of two things. Number one, the pandemic's actually changed how people are thinking about their money and what they're doing with it. And the second thing is that this economic pressure is very strong and hitting people who maybe haven't felt it before, which means that you have people who've maybe never missed a payment, who are going to stumble, who may actually even fall into collections. So as an organization, that means that you need to look at the typical communications that you're using and realize that these old faithful strategies, maybe they don't actually work as well. Maybe they're not as appropriate as they could be for this new group of at-risk consumers. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that it's not all bad news. We've actually seen that there have been changes in consumer behavior coming out of the pandemic that are advantageous. They're opportunities, I think, to come up with some new strategies in order to help people to actually deal with the coming money challenges. Can we not maybe lean into some of the things that helped them get through the pandemic? So what actually happened to people during the pandemic? Well, the relationship they had with money changed, and their money behaviors also changed. Case in point in Canada, thinking about behavior change, well, we saw that Canadians were paying down debt faster than ever. In a single year, we saw credit card debt fall by 18%. Many have even reduced the number of debt accounts that they have, so maybe cutting up one of those credit cards that they don't use so often. And in terms of thinking about how they want to use their money in the future, so in 2023, for instance, 44% of Canadians are saying that they're hesitant. They don't necessarily want to use credit as much as they used to and prefer to actually spend in another way. So during the pandemic, I think that means that there has been this change in mindset. So consumers have gained a sense of control, if not some extra competence over their money. And now they're facing the fear of losing that control. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think, because people have seen that they can successfully get through financial challenges. It maybe means that they're more willing to actually deal with challenges that come in the future. But at the same time, that fear of losing control and kind of spiraling back away from that autonomy is really negative. So what organizations need to do is make sure that they're thinking about how do we help consumers maintain a sense of control? How do we give them that opportunity to be resilient? I think these themes will be incredibly important to consumers in the months to come. Another thing that happened during the pandemic really relates to how people think about and speak about money. So money taboos were swept away maybe, or maybe they've just temporarily been shifted. But the fact is that people talked differently about money during the pandemic. They actually talked about debt. This wasn't something that's hidden away. They were actually being more open about the fact that there are challenges and that communities are facing challenges in terms of figuring out how to make ends meet. So how can organizations maybe lean into that? I think it's looking for opportunities to let people continue having difficult money conversations because maybe they're a little bit more tolerant of that right now because they have been doing that. So encourage those difficult money conversations, whether that's within households, between family members, with credit counselors, or maybe with advisors. In terms of applying a similar behavioral lens to consumers in LATAM, what we're seeing there, if you just move us, Shannon, to the next slide, is that there are some similar observations here. So we certainly saw that consumers in LATAM are moving away from credit, but it's at a faster rate than what we're seeing with folks here in North America. And this is making a lot of sense, right? It's a reaction to the rising cost of living. Consumers want to move away from those high fees and interest rates. And in place of credit spending, what's happening is consumers are opting for new payment methods. So whether that's digital wallet transactions or direct bank transfers, we're seeing that they're embracing new ways of doing things. And that means a lot if you're thinking about, as an organization, how do we help consumers? It means that, if people have changed one type of money behavior, it's probably hot, and that means that they'll be receptive to maybe changing other types of money behaviors, which could include how they approach debt repayment. So before I pass things over to Juan, I just wanted to make one or two final points. So I think the first one is that the pandemic has imposed certain conditions that are good or bad that are going to very likely impact how people are reacting to economic pressures next year. And so we can build those things into our strategies. And Juan's also going to take us a further level into the psychology of debt and tell us what we've learned so far in the work that we've done at BEworks to help people either make sure that they stay on track with payments or recover if they fall into collections.
Thank you, Michelle. In order to really understand why people engage in certain behaviors relating to how they tackle credit acquisition, credit use, debt repayment, and so on and so forth, what we really need to do is dig deeper into the psychology of debt management. And this includes a whole range of behaviors, all the way from what people look for in a credit product and how they expect they will use it in the future, to what happens when they get into debt, how they think about different types of debt, how they seek out help or maybe don't seek out help. The psychology of debt management allows us to better understand people's debt-related behaviors, uncovering the underlying psychological mechanisms that drive them. And it does this by asking critically important questions that get to the bottom of how people behave in particular contexts. Like, for example, in cases where people owe money, what determines whether they will pay back? And so if we move to the next slide. So you might think the answer to that question lies in three distinct factors that have traditionally been the focus of repayment communications. On the one hand, we have information, which basically assumes that if you let people know what they owe and how to pay it back, they will just go ahead with that repayment behavior. The second one centers around incentives, which basically assumes that we should just highlight what people stand to gain to drive that repayment behavior, be that peace of mind, money you would have paid in interest, or freedom to spend. And the last one is the flip side of the second one, basically leveraging penalties and disincentives, such as what people stand to lose to motivate repayment. Now, be that money, loss of face, buying power, time spent dealing with collectors, etc., etc. But as you might expect, those are not necessarily the answers, or at least the only answers from a behavioral economics perspective. So it turns out that information, education, incentives, and disincentives don't always work and can even backfire. So when you want to get people to do something, it's always good to have more than just these three traditional approaches to rely on. From the study of psychological science and behavioral economics, we now know that people very often use mental shortcuts to make decisions, what we tend to call heuristics. And so figuring out what those mental shortcuts are, how they influence or impact decision making, and then building them into your strategies can truly help to change behavior. But a particularly interesting insight from behavioral economics is that these mental shortcuts make us behave irrationally in a predictable manner. So what is predictably irrational about debt repayment? Well, the fact that when people have multiple outstanding loans and a limited amount of money to allocate, they tend to put money towards the smallest of those debts and tend to neglect the others. Now, this defies what we would call the rational model of behavior, where people should pay the minimum for each debt to avoid surcharges and penalties, and use the remaining cash to pay down the load with the highest interest rate. But then, why do people behave in this irrational manner? Well, our co-founder and world-renowned behavioral economist, Dan Ariely, has conducted research using a debt management paradigm where it has been evidenced time and again that people commonly show debt account aversion. Now, debt account aversion is just a term used to describe the tendency of people to avoid having many debts. So for instance, people would rather have two debts than 3 debts. And this is reflected in real-life debt management behavior, where people prefer to pay off one debt, which oftentimes is the smallest debt out of the ones they have, rather than reduce the debt with the highest interest rate, or make a plan for how to pay down debts so they owe less money over time. Why? Because it feels good to wipe out a debt account, even if money is being lost in the long run. And this tendency can be further exacerbated if we are low on resources. Resource scarcity can trigger all kinds of irrational behaviors, and these can be resources of any kind. Stockpiling toilet paper during a pandemic comes to mind as an example, but really, for fear of spending our energy trying to break down that example, I will tell you about a field study completed by researchers in the States. Molinathan and Shafir, the researchers, studied sugarcane farmers, and they documented a scarcity mindset in these individuals, all tied to the timing of their harvest. So it turns out these farmers harvest their crop once a year. So that's when the bulk of their income is earned. As farmers wait for their harvest and their funds get lower and lower, they start hoping for a good harvest, but also worry about a poor one. But the really interesting thing is that if you give these farmers a series of problem-solving tasks before harvest time, they don't do too well. But when the harvest is in and their income has been secured for the year, their performance goes up. In this case, they score an average of 10 points more. And this is controlling for type of problem solving, task, and learning. Now, this has been replicated in other contexts. And in general, the finding is that when funds are running dry, a scarcity mindset tends to exert a tax on IQ scores. But so this begs the question, what is scarcity mindset doing to the way that people think? What is it that is hurting people's problem-solving ability? And so we move to the next one. We can see that the scarcity mindset prevailed during the pandemic and is back now that people are afraid we are going into a recession. And it has 3 potentially detrimental effects on our decision-making. First, it can drive tunneling, which is when solutions are overlooked or go unnoticed. This happens because the scarce resources dominate the attention and all else gets eclipsed. And because of this, people tend to overlook important information. Like when people go out shopping on a tight budget, solely focused on price, and then an attractive deal makes you overlook some of the key features of the product. Same thing if you're shopping for a credit product. But it can also aggravate present bias, which puts present pain top of mind for customers. So what people stand to lose becomes of greater concern to them. And this is reflected in an amplified intolerance for hassles, like when you anticipate that a salesperson is just going to generate unnecessary friction. So you decide to shop online instead of going to the store. So anticipated friction and hassles become a bigger hurdle, even impeding some potential customers from getting a new credit card, for example. And finally, it puts customers at risk of satisfying behavior, meaning they will only do so much to help themselves, even when they make the effort to act. And we can see this, for example, when customers act to get a discount for getting a card, but they don't bother doing the extra work to attain a bigger reward, such as activating the card and using it, or when they make the effort to pay a lump sum but then don't commit to a repayment plan. These are just some of the challenges posed by the psychology of debt management. But behavioral economics also offers some innovative solutions to help customers better manage their debt. And we'll now show you a couple of examples from challenges that we've helped our clients at BWorks tackle. So in the first of these case studies, we'll take a look at how we increased electricity debt collection with behavioral economics for a large electric utility and distribution company. So recently, the Ontario government placed a moratorium on electricity disconnections during winter months. And while this move had noble intentions, it also removed the tangible consequence of not paying, and hence one of the major motivators of debt repayment. So unfortunately, this could also result in an accumulation of debt going into the warmer months, making it even more difficult to pay off. So the client saw an opportunity to leverage behavioral economics to optimize collections communications, going beyond traditional methods of education and incentives to reduce debt accumulation. But to tackle this challenge, we first had to identify the key psychological and behavioral barriers to electricity debt repayment. So after carefully mapping the customer journey, we began the process of identifying and prioritizing the most important psychological barriers at critical contact points, from the moment the utilities bill was issued and the late payment reminder notice sent to clients, all the way to disconnection. And we found 4 key types of barriers. On the one hand, barriers related to attention and comprehension, which are linked to the hassle costs customers perceive, but might not actually be real. And on the other, barriers to actually getting contact and pay the balance, which present real hassles for customers. Under the attention category, we found an overall lack of salience, prompting clients to ask, why should I read or listen to this? Coupled with an information avoidance attitude of, if I don't read it, I don't have to deal with it. Under the comprehension category, we found a general lack of relevance and clear calls to action, leading customers to question whether communications materials apply to them or what they were supposed to do with them. Then customers would hesitate to actually get in contact with the company because they felt anxious and even embarrassed, or they altogether procrastinated because they felt they just couldn't deal with it right now. And when it came to actually paying the balance, under the influence of present bias and scarcity mindset, they would prioritize money for things they'd want now, or just avoid it because it's such a pain, with customers saying things like, I hate paying this bill every month. So after identifying the key barriers, we set to minimize the perceived and real hassle costs with behavioral insights and tactics. And one of the communications materials we intervened was the late payment reminder notice. So what we did was design new versions of the late payment reminder notice based on the core information and message that the company wanted to convey, but optimized with behavioral economics concepts. And based on our investigation with the company and our deep dive of the scientific literature, we hypothesized people differ in their self-concept and their sensitivity to urgency. So we created the prototypes that highlighted slightly different features based on this insight. But each of these incorporated key modifications based on the attention, comprehension, contact, and payment barriers we had identified previously. So in the next slide, we can see that the consistency letter, for example, incorporated phases and strategic use of colors to draw attention to key information. It also broke up information into more digestible chunks and made it personally relevant to facilitate comprehension. We also added the customer's history of timely payments to appeal to their self-concept and drive consistency. But we also highlighted how being consistent is not only in the company's interest, but in the customers as well. And finally, we added a clear call to action to enroll in pre-authorized payment behavior. All of these interventions were designed with distinct behavioral principles aimed at improving not only how the payment process is perceived, but more importantly, to drive actual repayment behavior. In the next example, we'll see how a slightly different approach provided a quantifiable improvement in debt management. So in this second case study, we'll look at how we promoted healthy debt management behaviors from day one through what we call preemptive nudging. So in this case, our client, a large financial services and retail company, worked with us to increase the number of near-prime credit card accounts that graduate to lower risk bands. This work was necessary because only 11% of near-prime accounts were graduating to lower risk bands, and it was taking on average 36 months for this to occur. In addition, 17% of accounts were being written off. So our objective was to prevent non-payment behavior from day one and to reduce write-offs using a science-based strategy. So as usual, we started off by analyzing the customer journey and identifying psychological barriers at each key step that could cause non-payment behavior from day one, from activating and purchasing with the card to getting your statement and even accumulating rewards. These barriers were the jumping off point for building a preemptive nudging strategy. And so what we did was create a set of behavioral strategies to drastically reduce non-payment behavior and write-offs, starting with the onboarding process of clients and reinforcing it with a strategy to maintain that behavior throughout. The new onboarding experience promoted credit literacy to set realistic expectations. It incorporated behaviorally optimized due date notifications to help customers keep track of due dates via online tools and apps. And it improved the recall of due dates by using payment date anchors. Now, once these intentions and behaviors were set, we made sure they were maintained with vivid envelope communications that enhanced seasonal letters to help mitigate delinquency. We leveraged impulse behaviors to increase the number of people making small but frequent payments. And we also used consecutive payment incentives to nudge good payment behavior. And we encouraged payments with the use of a performance tracker to visually depict credit performance. So this proved to be a comprehensive behavioral strategy, leveraging a number of evidence-based tactics. But how would it really fare? So in order to answer that question, we ran an experiment comparing the preemptive nudging strategy with the usual way the company conducted its business. More specifically, we analyzed and quantified the number of customers who actually made payments between statements, which was a good indicator of whether or not they were incurring or likely to incur in non-payment behavior. And what we found was that the preemptive nudging strategy generated a sizable 11% lift in the number of payments compared with the control. So this was the evidence the client was looking for and the kind of solution they wanted to implement to help their customers better manage their debts. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Michelle.
Thanks a lot, Juan, for telling us about some of those tried and true strategies that we've used, not only to help people stay on track, but also obviously to really help pull people out of collections when the going gets tough. I think to zoom us back out, there are a few things we wanted to leave you all with today. I think if we're thinking, if we're trying to understand, like, what's an effective strategy to help with debt repayment or preemptive encouragement of ongoing payment, what are sort of the key ingredients, I suppose? And I think the first is that we need to make sure that, that strategy is at a minimum fitting into the journey that people are on. So that's to say, recognizing, for instance, that you may have some people who are running into trouble who've never previously missed payments, and making sure that the communications and the strategies that you're using are aligned with that. Otherwise, they may come across as a little bit tone deaf or too heavy-handed. Another thing is to recognize that there are existing tried and true mental shortcuts that people use all the time when they're thinking about their money, when they're thinking about, how to prioritize different types of debt that they have to pay back. So those are the biases and barriers to which Juan spoke. And a behavioral strategy really needs to know what those are and have a way of actually filling those gaps or helping people to get around them. I think the last thing to really leave you with, though, is to look at the choice architecture, look at the features of the specific conditions we're living in, and see if there are ways to leverage maybe what's unique about what has just happened. For example, with the pandemic and how it's changed people's relationship with money and what they're doing with their money. I had given you some different examples at the outset. For instance, how we've maybe gained a little bit more of a feeling of competence related to our finances, or maybe how we're a little bit maybe more amenable to, using different modes of payment. How can we piggyback on those sorts of things to build strategies that maybe take us in slightly different directions than what we've tried before, because we're able to, make use of where people are actually at. So in sum, I think that's what we would like to leave you all with today. And we thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Juan. And thank you for all the attendees today. I hope you enjoyed that session. Very insightful. Certainly, I've learned some key strategies that we could take forward to some of our clients in the future. So we will be sharing a recording of this webinar with you. If you don't follow us on social media, please visit our website. If you want to reach out to either Juan or Michelle, you can contact us by the details that we shared in this webinar, or visit our website there and you can complete one of our contact forms. Have a good day, everybody, and thanks once again. Goodbye.